A very important scientist living in France at the time, a Russian guy named Elie Metchnikoff. And he was fascinated by our bodies and how they stave off disease. And he'd actually later would go on to win the Nobel Prize in 1905 for discovering the role of phagocytes, these crucial cells in our immune system. So he studied cholera under the microscope. And by co-culturing it with certain bacteria from the human intestines, what he found was very interesting, was that certain species of bacteria supported and stimulated cholera's growth, whereas other species prevented it. So he subsequently concluded that the right balance of microbes inside the intestines could help stave off disease. And he went on to continue research for the rest of his life into how people could prolong their lives and stave off illness. And he particularly focused in a group of people in Eastern Europe, mainly in Bulgaria, who were living exceptionally long lives. And one of the reasons he attributed to this was that they commonly consumed fermented milk. And this has since been looked at, the microbial profile of this milk, very much like mass, and one of the main species in it is Lactobacillus bulgaricus, this common culture which is used in commercial yogurt. So as I said, Metchnikoff taught us that many microbes inside of our intestines were good for us, and many of them were bad for us. And what I like to refer the gut microbiota to is an ecosystem. We are covered in microbes, both on us and inside of us. But the vast proportion of these are inside our cecum, at the start of our large intestine. And we are outnumbered by bacteria, just about maybe 1.3 to 1. There's roughly 40 trillion bacterial cells in our body and 30 trillion human cells. If you count the gene count, we are outnumbered 150 to 1. So if this ecosystem is disturbed, it can lead to a lot of issues for our body. Our gut microbiota is in direct contact with everything that we consume. So if this is disturbed in any way, this can lead to disrupted food absorption, which can lead to adipogenesis and the growth of fat cells and even weight gain. If this is disturbed, it can also affect the intestinal permeability, this gut barrier, which can then lead to chronic inflammation. But how is the gut microbiota influenced itself? Well, in a number of different ways. There are some ways that we can't control, things like our genetics, but there are other ways as well, things like our antibiotic use, our environment, even our mode of delivery at birth. But arguably the most important and most changeable is that of our diets. We eat every day, it's a habitual thing, and this is something that is so important for this ecosystem of microbes inside of us. At birth, our gut microbiota, its diversity is very narrow. There's very few species there. And as we are weaned onto whole foods in the first few months of life, this begins to increase, and by the age of 2 or 3 years, it resembles closely that of an adult. It's fairly steady. But it's not only probiotics or prebiotics that we need to depend upon. There are many other foods that support the growth of a healthy microbiota. And we're at the Yogurt Summit here today, so we have to look at fermented foods as well. And fermented foods have the added benefit of having both healthy microorganisms inside of them and also the metabolites they produce, usually lactic acid through the lactic acid fermentation. So these include yogurt, cheese, mass, which I've just been introduced to here, sauerkraut, kefir, and some of these other obscure ones as well. So we're at the Yogurt Summit. What is the evidence for yogurt affecting the gut microbiota in both healthy and diseased states? Well, this is one study looking more of a fermented milk with strains very similar to yogurt. And what it found was that patients with IBS who took a fermented milk product for 4 to 6 weeks, they had increases in some of these species in their intestines, bifidobacteria, lactobacillus, and streptococcus. And this is probably expected because these were the strains that were in the fermented milk product. What was interesting, though, was that consuming this fermented milk product daily also reduced the relative abundance of certain pathogenic species, namely Balaphila wadsworthia. And finally, there was also an increase in the production of butyrate, one of these important short-chain fatty acids, which are very good at maintaining the integrity of the epithelial barrier. They're involved in anti-inflammatory mechanisms and a number of other health benefits. So there is evidence there that fermented milk and yogurts can have a beneficial effect at maintaining and maybe even improving the health of a healthy microbiota. So this brings me on to what is one of the most fascinating areas in microbiota research today, and that is the gut-brain axis. We essentially have two brains, one in our inside of our heads and one inside of our gut. And these are connected both physically and biochemically through a number of ways. The first is through the peripheral nervous system. Our brain has billions and trillions of neurons which can spread through the peripheral nervous system throughout the body. And then one important nerve is called the vagus nerve, which physically connects the central nervous system in the brain down to the gut. The interesting thing is, even when this is severed, the gut can still continue to function as if it has a brain of its own. The second link is through the immune system. The immune system is arguably centered in the gut, where many of these immune cells occur and take place. The third way is through neurotransmitters, and these are the brain chemicals which can affect the way that we think and feel. Now, the interesting thing is that a huge proportion of these are actually produced in the intestines. And there's an estimated figure out there that serotonin, nature's antidepressant, 90% of that is in fact produced in the gut. So this is just one example in a healthy state. 36 women were taken and fed a fermented milk product in a study over in California, and then put into an fMRI machine to see if there were any changes in their brain. And what was found was very interesting. By taking in this fermented milk product compared to just a standard milk every day, they found that the fermented milk altered the brain activity involved in emotion and sensation. So this habitual dietary regime, just over the course of a few weeks, can actually change the signaling in the brain related to emotion, sensation, and other behaviors. As I've mentioned, things like probiotics have huge potential to treat certain disease states. But if we're looking at maintaining a healthy microbial environment, we need to be focusing on a more holistic approach and looking at habitual dietary intakes, which can maintain and sustain a healthy environment and maybe even improve it. The gut microbiota is a complex ecosystem, but it is flexible both for the good and for the bad according to our environment. It responds to diet and other treatments, and we need to figure out how to maintain this and how to recover it again in cases where it's impaired. And so it really is a pillar of both physiological and possibly even psychological functioning as well, as might be shown with future studies. I think this is an important concept for our gut microbes as well. We can't depend solely on one single intervention for trying to restore microbial balance. We need to be looking at a number of different dietary approaches in order to maintain this diversity and this health. And so this list here is just many foods which I've talked about today and which have backing behind them to support the microbial environment, from these fiber-rich plant-based foods to these fermented foods as well, which can supply a number of different nutrients and maybe different microbes as well.